Thanks, everyone, for joining our Budget Beat call. This is Precious Buchu, Outreach and Operations Coordinator at the Washington State Budget and Policy Center. Today on Budget Beat, we'll hear from Julie Watts, Deputy Director here at the Budget and Policy Center, and we'll hear from Louisa Warren from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who'll update us on federal budget proposals, including the upcoming Congressional Budget Resolution and the recent U.S. Senate health care bill. For those of you who are not familiar with the Budget and Policy Center, we are a research organization dedicated to advancing the prosperity of all Washingtonians. We host these calls throughout the legislative session to provide relevant information and news from Olympia. A few quick housekeeping notes before we jump in. There are a number of people on the line, so we have muted all lines to avoid background noise. If you have questions for us, please send them to us using the chat function on ReadyTalk. We will respond to as many as we can during the call. We will be recording this Budget Beat call, which will be posted on our website soon. So, as I've said, the focus of today's call is on the federal budget proposals and the health care bill. First, let's hear from Julie Watts. Julie, can you give us an overview of how President Trump's proposed budget will impact Washington State?
Thank you, Precious. As many of you know, President Trump released his budget proposal last month, and before we launch into talking about what is happening in Congress right now, I just want to give folks a bit of an overview of how President Trump's budget proposal would impact Washington State's budget. So although Congress has decided that President Trump's budget is not a starting place for their negotiations, it is really important for us to understand how important some of the programs that are on the chopping block are for Washington State. The President's budget proposal is a pretty good illustration of that. It's also important because many of the proposals to cut or eliminate health and social programs that have been introduced by Republicans and Speaker Ryan before, and we're likely to see them again in the congressional budget negotiations. So the first slide you were seeing shows the proportion of our state budget that comes from federal grants. Federal grants come from one or two places in the federal budget. The first is a mandatory spending, and so that includes all of the entitlement programs like Medicaid, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Program, or TANF. The other area of the federal budget is what is called non-defense discretionary spending. That is the money that needs to be authorized each year in the budget process. So both of those kinds of funding put together make up 28% of Washington's total general operating funds, so close to 1/3 of our total state budget. The next slide shows the cuts to mandatory spending programs in President Trump's budget. So he calls for cuts to Medicaid that begin in 2020. And if you take Trump's budget and also assume that the American Health Care Act passes, which Trump assumes in his budget, and you put those two estimates together, the result is that over 10 years, Medicaid would be cut by 45%. And a 45% cut to Medicaid spending in Washington State would equal $4.5 billion a year. So that's per year, not per biennium. Trump's budget would also shift the cost of SNAP funding to the states. That would result in a cut of about 25% over 10 years. So a 25% cut to SNAP would equal a loss of $363 million to the state each year to ensure that people who are living in poverty just get basic food. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program is also cut in Trump's budget by 60, in Washington State that would represent $76.6 million a year. And the Social Services Block Grant is also eliminated, which is about $35.1 million a year to Washington. The next slide gives just a few, but not all of the programs in the non-defense discretionary spending portion of the federal budget that would be cut under Trump's budget. So among the programs that the Trump budget would eliminate are education programs and programs that serve people with lower incomes. So the first two programs, the 21st Century Community Learning Centers and the Supportive Effective Instruction State Grant, these are both areas of education funding in Washington. The 21st Century Community Learning Centers pays for low-income schools to have after-school programs. Now, the Community Services Block Grant, the Low-Income Energy Assistance Program, the Community Development Block Grant, and the Home Investment Partnership, these are all programs that are eliminated in Trump's budget. And then the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, which funds workforce centers in Washington State, would be cut by 38.8%, which would cost the state $28.6 million in training for people to who have been displaced in the workforce to be able to get back to work and get higher paying jobs. So those are some pretty significant impacts on Washington State's budget. And all of that is just to give you a sense of what these cuts could mean for our ability to meet our obligations to Washington residents, and really how the federal budget could leave the state on the hook for huge cost overruns and budget cuts in the future. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Louisa Warren. Louisa is the Deputy Director of State Strategies and Engagement at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C., where she manages all of the federal safety net campaigns in the states. So Louisa, can you just tell us what is happening next in the federal budget process, and what are congressional Republicans likely to do?
Thank you so much, Julie. It's good to be with all of you today. So in terms of what might happen next in the congressional budget process, let me just take a moment to talk at a high level about how the congressional budget process works, because it doesn't work like the state budget process, for better or worse. So the key thing to keep in mind here is that the first thing out of the gate after the president's budget blueprint plan has been released, as Julie just walked through some of the devastating impacts of the president's budget plan in Washington. Next, the House will put together a budget resolution. This is not actually a detailed budget proposal. This is sort of the roadmap for putting together a more detailed set of appropriations bills. Sometimes it can be thought of, and it might be more equivalent to a process where your budget chairs in the legislature might give subcommittee chairs targets to meet as they put together their specific appropriations proposals. So it's kind of like that in the sense of the House budget resolution will lay out some high-level targets on spending and on the taxes side that they will be looking to meet over the coming few months as they go back to different committees to come up with the details. And then, there is a much longer process of then the Senate will make its own budget resolution, and then eventually, maybe sometime this fall, they'll actually sort of move the entire appropriations process in more detail forward. The reason the House budget resolution and what happens with the Senate budget resolution is so important is because members of Congress want to use reconciliation, the process that probably many of you have become familiar with in the health debate. They want to use reconciliation, which is an arcane budget rule that basically allows you to not have to abide by the filibuster rule in the Senate. In other words, if you use reconciliation as a budget process, then in the Senate you only need 51 votes to pass any legislation, as opposed to the usual 60 votes, which is the amount required in order to overcome a filibuster. And what that also means, politically speaking, is that in the Senate, as we're seeing play out right now on health, Senator Mitch McConnell would only need Republicans to support a budget resolution. Now, there are rules associated with what can be done in a reconciliation bill, and one of those most important rules is that it cannot negatively impact the deficit in the long run. And so what will be put together in the House budget resolution is, not so dissimilar from a state budget, which is that the House and then the Senate will be required to balance their budget. It will have to have equal things going on the spending side at the same level as what they're bringing in on the tax side. Now, what we're really worried about in terms of the House is we fully expect that the House budget resolution will look very, very similar to the Trump budget resolution. And let me just stay a little bit longer on the timeline, and then we'll talk more in detail about why we think that's the case. So in terms of timeline, I just want to underscore, I'm not going to go through every one of these bullets, but that things are fluid, to say the least, in terms of what is happening in Congress right now. Obviously, there's a lot at stake and also a lot of question marks for what comes next, all pinning on what goes down in the Senate on health care in the next week. However, at this moment in time, we actually need to be ready and need to operate as if this is possible, that the House Budget Committee could actually mark up their budget resolution as soon as next Wednesday, the last week of June. Now, that may also not happen at all, and they might come back after the July 4th recess and try to put it together in July, or they might flip all the way till September. We literally do not know at this juncture. However, we do know that while we don't have much influence, honestly, over what the Budget Committee puts together in terms of the House budget resolution, we do have an opportunity to shape what happens with the House floor vote on the House budget resolution. And basically, you put the pieces together here. If the House budget resolution looks fairly similar to the Trump budget plan, we will then need to be in high-octane mode to really document and tell the story of what happened with the budget. So that is a sort of preview of we need to be poised to act. I want to be also clear, though, that the good news is we actually have the July 4th recess to build up that drumbeat of opposition to what has been laid out in the House budget resolution. We won't influence the markup right away. You know, there is some rapid response. If it were to really drop Wednesday or Thursday of next week, we might start to get leaks to the press of what's in it, the numbers, and so forth. By Tuesday of next week, we can start to sort of iron out our response. But really, that 4th of July recess will be this very, very critical period in which to let our members of Congress know what we think about the budget, and to particularly ensure that moderate House Republicans are hearing that message very, very loud and clear. Because as you all likely know from watching what has happened on the health side, in the House there is a very wedged and divided Republican caucus between the very conservative Freedom Caucus and House moderate Republicans that helps potentially slow the House budget resolution down and strengthens our hand in terms of defeating really terrible things to come along the line of the rest of the budget process. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to just go a little bit deeper at sort of what might be in a House budget resolution and why we are worried and what's at stake. So many of you maybe heard when the president's budget was released sort of a lot of statements from members of Congress saying, well, this is dead on arrival. We don't need to, we don't support this kind of draconian set of cuts to major programs that help low-income people, to K-12 education, to wholesale eliminating various block grants like those that Julie mentioned in her portion of the presentation. It was a massive step backwards in terms of what it proposed with huge implications should it be implemented. However, the key thing to remember is that the president's budget plan and all of these elements you see up on your screen have actually all been in House budget proposals that were passed and proposed over the last same years, particularly those by Speaker Paul Ryan. So we have a pretty decent idea of what we might expect in the House budget resolution. And go to the next slide, please. What we basically expect is that we will get trillions of dollars in entitlement cuts, i.e. cuts to, quote, mandatory programs. These include things like Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and a variety of other non-low-income entitlement programs. We also expect, and this is the thing that is the wonky but really important piece of what could be in the budget proposal, is the reconciliation instruction that would require budget committees to immediately identify a minimum of $150 billion over 10 years in entitlement cuts. Now, and then there could also be a reconciliation instruction for deficit neutral tax reform. What that means is it's instructing Congress and basically forcing Congress in all future appropriations committees and process for the rest of the year to make very, 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 very large tax cuts. Well, the reverse is actually the logic, to make very, very large cuts to various low-income programs, various non-defense discretionary programs in order to pay for very large tax cuts for wealthy folks and large corporations. And we also expect to see very, very large cuts to non-defense discretionary funding paired with large increases in defense funding. So we could entirely see the budget resolution cut non-defense discretionary spending by about $5 billion below what has already been cut due to the wonky term of sequestration, while increasing defense spending by $72 billion, 5 to 72. It's not quite equal there between the non-defense and defense spending. So that's just a preview of sort of the numbers. And basically, as you see here in the screen, this formula is sort of massive cuts and a squeeze on these areas of the budget that ultimately are things like money for strong public schools that are accessible to everyone, healthcare like Medicaid, things like low-income heating and energy assistance programs, social services block grant, community development block grant, clean water treatment, and the list goes on and on and on of all the different things that are actually in these big budget areas. So that is basically what we expect coming down the pike. Again, the House Budget Resolution could start to move next week. It could also totally slip until September, but we do want to be ready to respond, and we can certainly talk more about how to do that.
So, Louisa, can you also give us, we know that the Senate has taken up their health care bill and just come out this week. Can you give us just kind of that legislative play-by-play update on what is happening with the Senate Republican health care bill that we just saw released yesterday?
Right. So yesterday, Senator Mitch McConnell unveiled most of what was the bill language for the Senate Republicans' long-awaited plan on health care. I think there's lots to say about what's in it, but the key top line is it's much of the same in terms of what the House passed, and in some cases it makes things worse, particularly on the Medicaid side. The overall thing to know about what is in the Senate health care bill is that it forces you to pay more and get less. So millions will still lose coverage. We might see some shifts in the Congressional Budget Office score of the bill once they do that, which of course has really been able to show us how many millions of people will lose their health coverage as a result of this legislation going through on the House side. We might see some differences there, but we're going to be talking about the neighborhood of 15, 16, 18 million people losing their health coverage if this were to become law. This bill also breaks President Trump's and Senate Republicans' promise to make the Senate bill better than the House bill. It does not do that. And it raises cost for health care. It imposes an age tax. It weakens protections for people with pre-existing conditions. It makes even deeper cuts to Medicaid. It defunds Planned Parenthood, and the list goes on. And along the way, it gives big tax cuts to the rich. So where are we? Well, we are at this point still headed at this juncture to a debate and eventual floor vote next week in the Senate. There are, in terms of sort of timeline of how this could go down, right now there are furious negotiations ongoing in the Republican caucus. We do not expect that the bill that was unveiled yesterday is the final bill language if it indeed goes to the floor next week. This will go similarly to what we saw in the House, where at the last minute there were amendments to the legislation. We think that we should be prepared for kind of what we call the Upton play. If you recall, there was an amendment brought forth by Congressman Upton that sort of volleyed the legislation seemingly in a more moderate direction, even though sort of the baseline of what was moderate had really dramatically changed. And so we will get sometime early next week, either Monday or Tuesday, an updated Congressional Budget Office score of whatever is the latest Senate bill language that they received. Again, may not be the actual final score, which means that we may not actually know, just like it happened in the House, what are the true impacts of the legislation that the Senate votes on. And then starting on likely Tuesday, they would start the debate for the bill. They would first have a motion to consider vote. And the only reason I mention the wonkiness of this procedurally is that we are hearing, a number of Republican senators and certainly a pretty enormous number of editorial boards around the country really calling out the secrecy of this process and calling on the Senate to slow down on this really consequential piece of legislation. So it is possible that on this process vote that enough folks may say, we need a little bit more time to do this. But if it just goes through like it might normally do, they would have 20 hours of debate. There will be amendments offered by Democrats, and then on possibly Thursday, they would actually hold the vote on the bill. Now, this is all very fluid, and there are many, many scenarios kind of being bandied about, but what happens. One of our goals is to try to buy ourselves more time. So the process critiques around the secrecy and really the need to kind of slow down and particularly, let constituents see what you're voting on, because nobody really has had much time to absorb this bill and they're likely to change it again, is something that we will be pushing. So there too, the July 4th recess is critical no matter what happens on the health front. It's either because they couldn't quite get it all together next week to bring the Senate bill to the floor, and then the 4th of July recess becomes this enormous opportunity to build a sense of outcry against what the Senate bill does, and or it becomes an opportunity for really educating folks about what it does after the vote. So that is the short of where we are. We very much still have time to influence what's happening in the Senate, and Senate Republican leadership is in a very tough spot right now, thanks to the extraordinary activism happening around the country.
So Louisa, clearly these proposed cuts in the federal budget, what's happening with the Senate Republican health care bill could have a huge impact on both the well-being of Washington residents and our state budget. So what can advocates in Washington state do to influence their federal policymakers?
So at a very general level, I think obviously you all are juggling a lot on the state level. Things are still very fluid and intensive at the state budget and your legislative session. So understand the challenge of multiple fronts here very clearly. That said, I think that, one thing the last 6 months have shown us in this era of resistance is that really the sort of possibly the only way that we can affect change with members of Congress in the direction that many of these proposals point our country going to is via back home engagement. And so I think that you as advocates, people who are directly organizing constituents, have an extraordinarily powerful role. I think on the budget specifically, to sort of tackle that first and then maybe say a few things about health, I think there are a few really important, slightly wonky, but still important messages that we really want to hammer home with particularly House members at this point, but also members of Senate, which is to really try to get members of Congress on the record to opposing any budget that requires cuts in assistance that help struggling families afford the basics. So I can send you guys the actual points on this, but opposing any budget that cuts things like Medicaid, SNAP, and Social Security income and on. And the code word there requires is their code word for reconciliation. We don't want that to actually be used, right? Because then it means that politically this is going to be Republicans in the Senate as the only deciders. And second, we want them to commit to oppose any budget that slashes funding for public investments in education, safety, clear air, and water and child welfare programs, and we want them to oppose any budget that paves the way for tax cuts that will lose revenue. So those are a set of principles that we are trying to preemptively get in front of members of Congress. And you all in Washington, right, are home to multiple House members, of course, but also a few that I would put in the category of very essential in terms of this whole kind of House moderate Republican strategy. And so for those, I think what you can do is to start contacting your members and to lay out your concerns about the direction you saw in the president's budget plan, because remember, that's basically a blueprint for what's to come, to use that as a hook to register your opposition to that direction, to say, I hope you will not support the same kind of direction in the House. This is a time to really also do some positive storytelling about the role of the various programs that would have been slashed in the president's budget plan were it to become law. So this is, and you all do this work at the state level, so you can leverage the sort of storytelling work. Earned media analysis, right? There's a whole set of tactics and tools that you all use all the time at the state level that I think are really important to use at the federal level. One thing I'll just say, and maybe it's in the weeds, but really, I would seek to build relationships with the DC-based staff of your members of Congress. So, like, if you're working on the budget, it's the budget legislative aid. If it's working on health, it's the health legislative aid. The in-district staff are also really important as well. But eventually you really want to be talking to the folks who are associated with the relevant committees and that kind of thing. So we have that contact information. You can always, you can reach out to Julie and she can make sure to get it to you, or we can also get it to you directly. I think on the health side, this is the DEFCON 5 period going into the next few days. So keep it up in terms of the drumbeat against what is in the Senate bill. Help us, really correct the myths that are getting out there about what it does and doesn't do. Help us really elevate that this is literally the most dramatic restructuring of Medicaid we've ever seen that would just have enormous ripple effects in our communities, our economies, whole systems that have been developed around that. And so everybody can really have a voice here.
Thank you, Louisa. We have time for just a couple of quick questions. Here's one that we have. Both the House and Senate health care bills would turn Medicaid into a block grant. We have also heard that they want to make SNAP a block grant. What would that mean for future funding for these programs coming to Washington State, and why are block grants bad?
All right, so the short answer is that the health bill has proposed a per capita cap on Medicaid, which is basically does the same thing as a block grant, but it's slightly different in the weeds. But the high level in both Medicaid and SNAP, those are programs that are so-called entitlement programs, in that if you are eligible for the program, there is no cap on the amount of federal funding for that program. So when a recession hits and people lose their jobs and their income goes down and they all of a sudden become, as a result, eligible for Medicaid and SNAP, because there is not an artificial cap on the amount of spending for the program, like a TANF block grant, for example, these programs are able to really respond well to changes in the economy. However, if we go to a block grant or some kind of cap on Medicaid or SNAP, we are going to not only eventually just result in cuts to the program that will result in fewer people getting access to food assistance or health coverage, it will also pass on a massive amount of money for the state to pick up. So this is what the health bill does, and I think we can certainly make sure you have some of the analysis, but it is passing the buck from the federal government to state legislatures and governors to say, we're no longer paying for our contribution into this vital program that we've said is important because we decided to, say, eliminate malnutrition in our country. You guys got to pick it up. And you all know well, as you work on your state budget situation, that you're not in a great place on that. And to be handed a bill of billions to pick up, or be told you're just going to slash health coverage or food assistance for thousands of people in your state is the tough sort of dilemma that people will be confronted with under a proposal like a block grant.
All right, we're just out of time, and I know some people still have questions. You're always welcome to reach out to me or Julie, and we can make sure to get that into Louisa. So thank you all for joining us today, and many thanks to Louisa Warren and Julie Watts for leading this webinar. Stay tuned for the next budget beat on the final state budget that is due at the end of this month. And stay tuned to our website, budgetandpolicy.org, for a recording of this call. After you sign off, a survey will pop up on your screen, and we'd appreciate if you give feedback. Have a great weekend.